Hello and welcome to Links Lives Natters. This podcast is listening to the voices of Lincolnshire. I'm Lesley and I'm delighted to be hosting this episode today. Now, Lincolnshire is often called Bomber County, but behind that title are extraordinary people, courageous decisions and stories that helped shape world's history. Today, I am joined by someone whose own journey is just fascinating. From studying modern language to joining the RAF at 35, to working in intelligence and now playing a key role in preserving Lincolnshire aviation heritage. Brian Riley, welcome to Links Lives Natters.
Good morning, thank you.
Thank you for coming here today. Before we dive into your story, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little about your background?
Well, going right back to when I was born in 1956, I was born in India because my father was working for Dunlop Throwing Company at the time. When I was 2 years old, we came back to Manchester where my little father came from anyway. I was brought up generally in Manchester and Blackpool where we moved to. After school, I went to study foreign languages at the University of Salford. And then following that, my first job was actually for an organisation that was little heard of at the time called GCHQ. After a couple of years there, I decided I wanted to actually see and deal more with people and pieces of paper. So I actually became a housing assistant in Stevenage Borough Council. And then after that, I wanted to use my languages again. So I joined Customs and Excise. However, unfortunately, you think customs, people arriving and you're talking to them in their own language. Actually, the largest part of Customs and Excise, which is now part of HMRC, was VAT. So inevitably, I ended up getting trained in accountancy and doing accounts. And I enjoyed it so much that at the age of 35, I decided to join the Air Force.
All right. Okay. Yes, that explains it. I think for accountancy, and I have done a little bit in my past. I can see why you might want to change. And that would bring you there. Brian, you began with a degree in modern languages. What took you from studying languages into joining RAF at 35, which many would see as a bold and unexpected move, other than the fact that accountancy wasn't really your thing?
Yes, I decided actually I'd got a hobby. I'd had a hobby all my life. It was military and aviation history. And that was largely as a result of actually talking to my parents. My father was in the airborne forces in the Mediterranean during the war. My mother lived in Manchester and was there when the German bombers were overhead. So I listened to their stories as a kid and I was fascinated by what this generation had endured. And I wanted to find out more about it. So I'd had this hobby that had been enduring. And I suddenly thought at the age of 35, why am I sitting here doing accountancy because I don't enjoy? I've got languages. I might be able to use them. Can I make my hobby pay and join the Air Force? And the answer was yes.
Fantastic. Well, yeah. And I think that's inspiring for everybody, even listening now, in the sense of you made your hobby into a career where you could make money. And, that's what a lot of people, I think, aspire to do. So fantastic. So you were commissioned later than many of your peers. How did that shape your experience within the RAF?
That's an excellent question. My wife, when she dropped me off at Cranwell on the 31st of March, 1991, she basically said, if you leave early, I'm bringing you straight back. However, she didn't need to pull that one on me because I was determined to get through. But obviously, I was a little bit more mature, shall we say, than the average entrant. And I had a life already. I had a wife, lived in a house in Luton, and I had a completely different life experience from the youngsters joining. My main concern, though, was physical fitness. At 35, you can't necessarily keep up that well with 18-year-olds. So I put a lot of effort into getting fit, staying fit. And actually, that wasn't the big problem. The problem I had was actually being treated a bit like a child because you were just a cadet like everybody else. And I even got on a disciplinary parade at night outside the College of Cranwell because there was some fluff on the floor in my room, which I missed. And you suck it up, you get on with it. With a 35, it's harder to suck up than an 18-year-old who's coming straight from school.
Yeah, you've got a lot of life experience behind you, and to have that,
Yeah.
you know, it is, yeah, a big leap back. So you initially joined the education branch before transferring into intelligence. What sparked that shift, and did it change how you saw the world?
I've always been interested in current affairs, international affairs, and travel, and using languages. As I mentioned earlier, my first job was at GCHQ, which I won't go into more detail about, but use of languages was very helpful at the time. So I had an interest. I'm quite a nosy person. I like to know how things work, and if they don't work, why don't they work? I like to kind of understand what motivates people and what doesn't. So having done the accountancy and then gone in the Air Force, the reason I went in the education branch was I was a training manager in a VAT. I was actually got to the point from beyond being a VAT inspector myself to actually training VAT inspectors. And whilst I didn't find accountancy the least bit interesting, I absolutely loved taking somebody brand new in the department and getting them to a position where they went out as a VAT inspector on their own 2 feet. Massively rewarding sensation. So going into the Air Force at that time, if you were over the age of 30, you only had 2 real options. Either go into the engineering branch, and I wasn't an engineer, or go into the administrative branch. And within the admin branch, there was a specialisation of education. So it was a natural match to go from training manager in customs and excise to an education officer. But it's a bit strange because as a linguist, and my colleague in my particular flight was also a linguist, we were in a management flight. We had to train new entrants in management skills. So we basically had to learn it before we taught it.
Oh, yeah, so you were educated before you educated.
Yeah.
I love
14
that.
hours in advance.
Oh, wonderful. There's nothing like a baptism of fire.
Exactly.
So, looking back on your RAF career, is there one moment that has really stayed with you?
It's that is a very interesting question as well. The beauty of the career in the Air Force or military is that you move around to gain experience. So the average tour for an RAF officer at the time was about 3 years, and then you move on. So that's great if the tour you're doing at the time isn't one you really like. If you do like it, it's a bit sad, but you have to put up with it. So I wouldn't say that there's any one particular moment. There's lots of moments in the Air Force. But there's one particular tour that stands out for me, and that was one very late on in my career. And that was at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. And as a German speaker, I love the fact that I could actually maintain language skills. But it was in a NATO headquarters, air headquarters. And the role we had was to carry out tactical evaluations or TACEVALs. And this is where you actually go to a NATO unit, whichever country it is, and you actually run a war for 3 days, and you test them to the limits to see that could they do this for real. And you also have a mentoring role, because if you find there are kind of things that they are missing, don't quite get, then you train. So I'm getting back to enjoying training people again. And I loved the international environment because it was all NATO nationalities. We travelled across the whole of Northern Europe and to Canada to carry out these evaluations. So it was a fabulous time, to be honest. It was a combination of languages, training, meeting people from all sorts of cultural backgrounds. It all came together. But I wouldn't call it a moment. It was a period rather than a moment.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, like, that whole combination of everything you loved encapsulated in
Yeah.
one tour must have just, you probably felt a little sad leaving that one because it did, yeah.
Do you think?
Yeah, because that encapsulated who you were and what you enjoyed and everything you'd been through.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. Yeah. Oh, fabulous. Okay, so let's bring it a little closer to home. We've talked about your enjoyment of travelling and it sounded fabulous going to Canada and Germany. But let's bring it back a little closer to home. Lincolnshire is often called Bomber County. In simple terms, why did the county become so crucial to the British air strategy in both World Wars?
Yes, the Bomber County title really is referring to the Second World War and the Cold War because of the strong association with the RAF Bomber Command. Many bases, airfields in the county. But way back in the First World War, you look at it and it was an agricultural county, and you think, how far is this from the Western Front? It's a long way. But what the Germans had developed were airships, and they were using them for military purposes. And the German Navy in particular carried out the world's first strategic bombing campaign in the First World War, because they had the reach. They could keep up, for 20 hours if necessary, these airships. The problem was they couldn't navigate easily, and especially with the blackout in Britain at the time. But the industry in Britain, the London docks were a major target. But when you look at the industrial areas of Britain at the time, they were in the Midlands and in northern England. Now, how do you get there from Germany or from occupied territories such as Belgium and northern France? Well, you fly across the North Sea and you turn west at some point, hoping your navigation's good. Now, when you're approaching the UK's eastern coast, you've got two good landmarks of shore, even on relatively dark nights. You've got the Wash and you've got the Humber. And of course, Hull itself was subject to attacks because that was a very important maritime area as well. But also, each of those two easily recognizable geographic features acted as a gateway. So if you kind of took your airship and headed inland from there, you were going to go over Lincolnshire. And you go beyond it, you can go to the industrial West Midlands and, Midlands generally, and even to the northwest of England. So it was a portal, if you like, into further parts of Britain, which is where they hoped to bomb. And when you look at what the Germans claim to have bombed on their raids, it's nothing like the bombs that landed in meadows in Lincolnshire. The Germans claimed that they made it back to home base, having been fired on savagely by the local defences. And actually, they killed a cow and they damaged, some glass windows.
Right.
So the proof was there. So we needed to set up some kind of defences against this. And Lincolnshire was a perfect place to start building or setting up landing grounds. So in the First World War, it was more fighter county and training county, because we carried out training for pilots and observers at the time as well. And that's the origins of the RAF coming to Lincolnshire. The development of bombers was later on in World War II.
Right. Okay. So the Bomber County came from World War II more
Yes.
so. Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. Wow, I love history. I love finding it because you don't always hear these stories, and it's important that we've got people like yourself who are out sharing them because, for the younger generation particularly, you can find, they're learning about history and maybe it doesn't feel that important, but to be showing that in the county that it happens in, for the local community, I think is really interesting, and showing them, keeping these stories moving. These stories otherwise would disappear. We have to keep them alive. And so thank you so much for being here and sharing this, by the way, because I find it very interesting. Yeah, so thank you. Okay, so you worked on a project in Lincolnshire. What was that project called? And can you tell me a bit more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I settled in Lincolnshire after retiring from the RAF because my last tour of duty was at RAF Wallington. I lived in a lovely county, so we settled here. I got a job on a project called Lincolnshire Bastion in the Air 1915 to 1918. And this basically was a National Lottery Heritage to Lincolnshire to tell the story, then a little round story of aviation heritage in Lincolnshire in the First World War. And what people don't necessarily appreciate is that during the First World War, Lincolnshire was one of the world's largest aircraft manufacturing centres. which people always associate Lincolnshire as an agricultural county.
Yes. Yeah.
But of course, if you are having agriculture, you need machinery to help with the ploughing, etc. And there were a number of industries here that were feeding the agriculture, and the type of engineering that you needed for building aircraft in the First World War was not black box electronics. It was hand skills. The same hand skills that could create ploughs could help build aircraft parts.
So it's that diversity,
Yes.
and from
Exactly.
building the machinery into building the aircraft parts. Wow.
So you've got three main manufacturers here. You've got Clayton and Shuttleworth, Lesley and Roby's.
Right.
And actually you can see Roby's name on the side of the old building, build base, it is now. And on the edge of the Titanic building, you can still see the letters C and X for Clayton and Shuttleworth.
Fantastic. What I'd like to ask you about now is what your current project is at the moment. What are you working on at the moment?
Well, I'm finishing off now on a project called Soldiers from the Sky. And it's a project, again, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So big thanks to all players of the National Lottery. And this project is actually managed by South Kesteven District Council. And what it does is it shines a light on the very little known airborne forces heritage in the South Kesteven southern part of the county. We tend to forget that in addition to RF Bomb Command during the war, we actually had large numbers of paratroopers and glider troops based in Lincolnshire, just over the border, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire. We got the paratroopers and glider troops of three nations in this area. We've got the British 1st Airborne Division, Bridge Too Far at Arnhem, British 1st Airborne Division. We've got the American 82nd Airborne Division, who were based in Leicestershire. And we've got Polish Independent Parachute Brigade, whose headquarters were in Stanford. And these three elements, if you like, were involved in D-Day and Operation Market Garden at Bridge Too Far. So a lot of us heard about this history, but we don't realise that Lincolnshire's on our doorstep. And there are places you can visit now that are still there, where there's airfields with runways that are little changed since the war. There are stately homes where paratroopers were based, and you can still see the graffiti on the walls from the paratroopers. So the funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund has allowed us to put information boards out at about 16 sites associated with the airborne forces in South Kesteven, and has allowed us to develop a website called soldiersfromthesky.co.uk, which has got an awful lot of information, and there's also a mobile app that you can put on your phone, so when you're in the field you can refer to stuff as well.
Oh my goodness, as an avid walker, and I spend a lot of time in Stamford, and I didn't know that. I'm sure my partner will be very pleased to know about this app that we can get. So when we're walking, we can see whereabouts we are in relation to these things.
Well, to get the film The Bridge Too Far is pretty well known.
Yeah.
Major international stars. And what I tend to do when I'm giving a public talk about this, I tend to associate the actor's name with the character I'm talking about. So, for example, General Urquhart, who was the British commander of the 1st Airborne Division, his headquarters were at Fullbeck Hall.
Right.
He flew to Arnhem. He was played in the film by Sean Connery.
Wow.
So, I could go on with a few more names. Anthony Hopkins played Lieutenant Colonel John Frost at Arnhem Bridge. And actually, John Frost was based at Stoke Rochford Hall and flew out of Saltby Airfield.
And this is why having people like you continue to share the stories is so important, because you're reminding and making it relevant for the younger generations as well. You know, and like I said before, these stories cannot disappear. We have to keep them out there. And what you're doing is just phenomenal. I mean, even me today, I'm learning something new about Stanford, and I spent so much time there. You know, it's so. Yeah, you've intrigued me now. I want to get the app, so when I'm walking around, I can find out. So brilliant. So, how important was Lincolnshire to building up to D-Day in operations and Market Garden?
Yeah. Well, basically, the fighting in the Mediterranean died down in late 1943. So a lot of troops were brought back to this country to prepare, together with troops already here, for the assault on the west of Europe, which later was known as D-Day. The 1st Airborne Division, British 1st Airborne Division, arrived in Lincolnshire in December 43 from the Mediterranean. The American 82nd Airborne Division arrived in February 44. They'd been out in the Mediterranean as well. and the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade moved from Scotland down into South Kesteven in July 1944. So, in actual fact, they were not here when D-Day took place. So, of all those three nations, in our airborne nations in our area, only the American 82nd Airborne flew into Normandy on D-Day. And if you remember the film The Longest Day, there are tragic scenes where there are fires in Saint-Mary-Église village in France, and the paratroopers are descending into the flames. They were paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division. The famous paratrooper who landed and was attached to the steeple of the church, 82nd Airborne. So they all have a connection to our area of Lincolnshire.
Wow. And it's just phenomenal what, the link back to Lincolnshire. So, Brian, as time moves on, how are we keeping it alive in our local area for our younger generations to be able to keep this alive as well? So is there places they can go and see things, explore? What can they do?
Yes, I mean, aviation heritage generally, an organisation called Aviation Heritage Lincolnshire, with which I'm associated, that has partner sites. There's about 20 historic sites in the county where people could go and see aircraft, airfields, displays, effectively museums in the county. So the Soldiers from the Sky project is an addition to that, because now what we're doing is adding information boards and statue of silhouettes of paratroopers at various locations in the county. For example, Grantham Station. As people pass through Grantham Station, there are large information boards there, and which give people QR codes so they can link to the website and find out more information. And just this week, we're actually putting out information boards at Trotford Wood, Northwood and Airfield, which is used by the American
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, I
By
know that
the-
one well.
by the American Airborne Pathfinders during the war. Eastern War Gardens.
Yeah.
That was used by a company of the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, the company that captured the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge Too Far, the road bridge. And in fact, one of their officers sadly was killed at the bridge, but he was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. And he was at Eastern, during the war, there was an Eastern Hall, which had been demolished since the war. So we've got information boards there. So there are sites you can visit, and there are leaflets that you can pick up, which has got a trail, so you can follow routes on bikes or by car or on foot. You can even follow routes. I've managed to research route marches, training route marches carried out by British paratroopers before D-Day and before Arnhem, where they would go out trolling along for 20 miles or more with equipment at speed. And you can follow these routes because the roads often are unchanged, apart from the Great North Road, which was the A1 you wouldn't want to follow now on foot.
Yeah, that would be a bit dangerous.
There
There's lots of other places.
are loads of other places you can see. So whatever your age, young or old, you can visit these places and get a sense of history.
That's fantastic. And I would encourage everybody to do that. I love going out hiking and having them, walks to follow. It just adds that bit of significance to the walk as well. So fantastic. So finally, after everything you've done, RAF officer, historian, heritage advisor, and what still excites you the most about aviation history?
I've always been excited by the prospect, listening to my parents and researching what that generation went through, not only for themselves, but for the rest of us. Because if they hadn't dug their heels in and said, no more, you are not taking this country, then the way our lifestyle would have been completely different now. And I think that subject needs never to be forgotten, what people went through, what they sacrificed for us. And I think I love when I get talking to people and people say, as you did earlier, I didn't know that. And there are these things on the doorstep that you can visit to keep the memories alive. Because sadly, most of these generations, First World War generations gone, Second World War very nearly. And it's down to us to keep the torch aflame and take their memory forward. And hopefully we can keep our fingers crossed that people learn from history.
Yes.
Looking at the world as it is today, I'm not entirely sure that is the case, but we can do our very best to educate so people have a better understanding of what mistakes were made in the past and perhaps not repeat them in the future.
Oh, definitely, Brian. I'm so grateful for people like you to keep it alive for us today, because you're right, our current generation and future generations, as much as can learn from the history of what's gone before, to create the life we have today. And I think it's just an important message that we don't lose, and think about the sacrifices that, you know, our grandparents, great grandparents who made for us to have the environment we have today to live in, which is so important. And I think somewhere it gets lost, so we need to raise the voice of it and re-educate. You're completely right.
It's actually been interesting in the project with Soldiers from the Sky. We've actually engaged with primary schools, and the kids have absolutely loved it. They've been painting all sorts of things on pebbles to commemorate it. And if you give them the information, they'll run with it.
Fabulous. Oh, I love the children getting involved. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today
Thank you.
and for sharing not just history, but perspective and insight and your passion. And you've definitely ignited it for me. So I hope he has for everybody listening today. And we'll encourage them to go and look for your website and all the information and all the walks. I know we'll be sharing it on our website. So from me, Lesley Hughes, and the whole team at Links Lives Matters, thank you for listening and watching. And remember, listen and watch the voices of Lincolnshire.